In the murky swamplands of South Carolina, where Spanish moss dangles like tattered shrouds from ancient oaks, and the humid air seems to carry whispers of long-buried transgressions, the decaying remnants of a place once known as Angel's Rest Chapel still cling to the earth. Between 1789 and 1832, more than 200 souls vanished after seeking refuge within this so-called sanctuary. When local authorities unearthed church records in 1923 records that were immediately sealed, the truth they discovered was chilling beyond belief. These documents revealed a cold, deliberate campaign of murder cloaked in the guise of divine mercy. The respected Whitworth family pillars of Southern society and stewards of a twisted religious order called the Order of Fallen Angels had transformed their plantation chapel into the most profitable killing ground in the antebellum South. What you're about to hear has remained buried for nearly 2 centuries. But the shadow of America's most sinister religious dynasty can no longer be ignored. Before we peel back the layers of horror that surround the Whitworth legacy, consider this. This story is not for the faint-hearted. It's for those willing to confront the darkest recesses of American history. If you count yourself among the truly curious and unafraid, subscribe now and comment below with your state. We want to know just how far these grim truths reach. Now travel with us back to 1789 to the heart of South Carolina's low country, where salvation came at a price no soul should ever have to pay. But to understand how such orchestrated evil could thrive, we must first understand the world that allowed the Whitworth Empire to flourish. The year was 1789. The United States was a newborn republic, still hemorrhaging from revolution. In the fertile, salt-choked lowlands of South Carolina, rice plantations sprawled endlessly toward the sea, ruled by a social order as fixed and unyielding as the tides. 30 miles inland from Charleston, the Whitworth family carved out their dominion, an empire not just of land and wealth, but of deception and death. At the helm was Gabriel Whitworth, 43 years old, towering at 6 feet, with prematurely silver hair and eyes the cold color of ice. His presence alone could quiet a room, and his voice, a rich, resonant baritone, could fill a chapel or cut a man down with silence. Born to a crumbling Virginian tobacco dynasty, Gabriel had watched his family's fortune vanish in the chaos of war. But where others saw ruin, Gabriel saw opportunity. His wife, Constance Whitworth Napton, descended from Charleston aristocracy wealth, born from rice and slavery. At 38, she retained a porcelain beauty, delicate and serene, her hands untouched by labor. But those who dared meet her gaze would catch a distant vacancy in her brown eyes, a quiet retreat into a place where the horrors of her household could not reach her. Their children were each uniquely unsettling. Ezekiel, the 24-year-old heir, inherited his father's intelligence, but added a streak of cruelty that even Gabriel found disquieting. His smile never touched his shadowed eyes. Though he had briefly studied at the College of Charleston, Gabriel called him home to oversee the delicate operations of their enterprise. Miriam, 22, was perhaps the most lethal of them all. Unlike her brothers, who used fear and force, Miriam wielded seduction and deceit. She could lull a frightened runaway into calm trust before leading them straight to their death. Golden-haired, blue-eyed, her beauty was textbook Southern charm. But beneath it shimmered a sadistic joy in human suffering. Then there were the twins Cain and Abel, both 20. Cain, larger and brutish, had hands like vices. Abel, smaller but keener, was the innovator of pain, his mind a wellspring of inventive torment. Raised to see themselves as divine instruments, they practiced cruelty with the calm precision of artisans, and young Lilith, just 16, was still being shaped for her role. Blonde, like her sister, with Gabriel's glacial eyes, she exuded an eerie maturity that unnerved even seasoned guests. She was being trained to replace Miriam, ensuring the family's ghastly tradition would continue unbroken. Gabriel's younger brother, Michael Whitworth, served as the plantation's overseer and Gabriel's closest confidant. A man of the fields, hardened by sun and toil. Michael also possessed a sharp intellect and understood that their mission required equal parts brutality and bureaucracy. His wife, Ruth, had died in childbirth 5 years earlier, leaving him to raise twin daughters, Mercy and Grace, now 13. The girls, educated in the same chilling theology as their cousins, lived under the same roof, absorbing every lesson of the family's corrupted creed. Then there was Raphael Whitworth, called Serif, a gaunt figure with sickly pale skin and washed-out green eyes. At 35, Serif had studied medicine in Edinburgh before the Revolution. But instead of healing, he became the family's anatomical expert, ensuring their victims lived just long enough to confess. When death came, it appeared natural, an illusion critical to maintaining their supply chain. He provided freshly harvested cadavers to prestigious medical schools, from Charleston to Philadelphia, each body accompanied by forged papers that claimed they were free people of color who had died of illness. The plantation's layout was terrifying in its efficiency. The main house, a towering Georgian structure, loomed over the rice fields. But it was the peripheral buildings that hid their most sinister secrets. Half a mile away, nestled within a grove of moss-draped oaks, stood the Angels' Rest Chapel. Finished in 1788, the chapel could seat 200, but rarely hosted more than 50. Behind its altar lay a concealed entrance to a basement network of holding cells walls, thick enough to silence screams airflow, designed to prolong life and darkness so complete it crushed the spirit. Next to the chapel sat what appeared to be a storage shed. In reality, it was Serif's laboratory where science and savagery were indistinguishable. In 1789, the Whitworths launched their Order of Fallen Angels, selling it to locals as a Methodist revivalist movement. Gabriel's impassioned sermons about salvation through suffering drew curious neighbors and nearby plantation owners. Reverend Thomas Hartwell, the local Methodist circuit rider, even welcomed the family's fervor, unaware that his trust would lead others into hell. Behind the sermons, the real mission began. Using a network that stretched from Charleston to Richmond, the Whitworths planted whispers among the enslaved. Carefully crafted tales circulated about a chapel deep in the swamps, a haven for runaways. A sanctuary offering food, rest, and passage to the north. The deception was meticulous. Stories were seeded with plausible detail, landmarks, secret phrases, and first-hand testimonies from supposed survivors who'd made it to freedom. All false. All designed to lure the desperate straight into the family's grasp. Meanwhile, Serif's correspondence with medical institutions elevated him to a trusted supplier. The bodies he delivered appeared legitimate. The paperwork, flawless. No one suspected that these cadavers were the end result of a systematic slaughter disguised as salvation, and no one asked where the fallen angels truly fell from. In the early decades of the American Republic, medical schools were more concerned with supply than scrutiny. No one asked too many questions about where the cadavers came from, especially when the price was right. And Sheriff Whitworth's prices were always right. He delivered bodies promptly, professionally, and with all the proper documentation meticulously forged, of course. While Sheriff handled the scientific side of the operation, Michael Whitworth oversaw the logistics. He managed the plantation's legitimate business affairs, ensuring the rice harvests flowed smoothly and profitably, and maintained a web of informants who spread tales of sanctuary through slave quarters across the South. He also kept close relations with bounty hunters, men whose livelihoods depended on finding runaway slaves. Michael helped them identify the most promising targets, turning human desperation into commerce. On the surface, Seraphim's Grace was just another plantation, albeit one with an oddly charitable reputation. Nearly 100 enslaved workers labored there, yet their conditions appeared unusually humane. They were better fed, housed in sturdier cabins, and granted limited mobility within the property. This apparent benevolence wasn't born of conscience. It was part of Gabriel Whitworth's masterstroke. A public image of moral superiority served as the perfect camouflage for an unspeakable truth. What made the Whitworth operation so particularly diabolical was how it weaponized faith. Gabriel's sermons were masterpieces of theological rhetoric. He quoted scripture with eloquence wove in references to early church fathers and Protestant reformers, and delivered it all with a fiery charisma that could stir hearts and silence doubters. Many who heard him preach were convinced they stood in the presence of a holy man, and Gabriel believed it. He was utterly convinced that his victims, those who came to Angel's Rest seeking hope, were already damned. Their fates sealed by divine will, he saw himself not as a killer, but as an instrument of God's justice, delivering wayward souls to their predestined end. This belief system insulated the entire family from guilt. They weren't murderers, they were redeemers. Locals noticed that strange things occasionally occurred at Seraphim's Grace. There were whispers of strangers passing through, of shadows, seen near the chapel, late at night. But no one dared confront the Whitworths. Gabriel served on the county commission, gave generously to local churches, and hosted opulent dinner parties that secured his place among the region's elite. When questions arose about missing persons or strange visitors, Gabriel expressed concern, joined the search efforts, and reassured everyone of his commitment to justice. Then came the autumn of 1791. Violent storms ravaged the Carolina coast, decimating rice fields and deepening the desperation among enslaved communities. Hunger and chaos drove many to flee and to seek out the rumored sanctuary of Angel's Rest. For the Whitworths, it was a windfall. In 1 month alone, 43 people arrived at the chapel's doors seeking refuge. With this sudden influx, the family's methods became ruthlessly streamlined. Ezekiel created a system of classification. Young, strong men were prioritized. They were often knowledgeable about escape networks, patrol routines, and weaknesses in plantation defenses. Slave catchers paid handsomely for such information. Mothers with children were targeted for their knowledge of other families' escape plans. The elderly or infirm those unlikely to yield profit were quickly and quietly disposed of. The process began with grace. Desperate travelers were met by Miriam, whose gentle voice, calm demeanor, and polished manners disarmed suspicion. She offered food, dry clothing, a warm bed, and hopeful words. She told them they had reached the right place, but before they could continue their journey north, their stories had to be verified. To protect the network, she'd say, with serene conviction. To protect everyone. During this grace period, the Whitworths listened. Miriam, with her seemingly innocent curiosity, coaxed valuable information from her guests. Gabriel conducted prayer meetings and private consultations, subtly probing their histories. Cain and Abel posed as fellow escapees, winning trust with fabricated stories of freedom and peril. The goal was simple: learn everything. Who else was planning to run? Where were the hidden shelters? What names? What routes? What signals? Once deemed thoroughly squeezed of value, victims were escorted, still believing they were on the path to salvation, into the chapel's basement. It was Serif's domain. His Edinburgh training had taught him how to prolong life, and his innovations in pain management allowed him to conduct interrogations that balanced suffering and preservation with clinical precision. His knowledge of anatomy was profound. He could press a nerve just so and unravel the strongest resolve. Abel documented every confession, cross-referencing it with previous testimonies. A database of human despair organized down to the last detail. The basement held 5 cells, each fortified with shackles and heavy doors. Soundproofing ensured that not a whisper of pain reached the ears of worshippers above during Sunday services. For 3 to 5 days, the captives endured Serif's slow unpeeling of their secrets. Those with no more to offer were carefully prepared for the next stage: dissection and shipment. Gabriel maintained detailed records ledgers filled with coded entries. Each victim received a number. Their physical details, personal history, extracted intelligence, and final outcome were all meticulously archived. These files were used to analyze patterns in escape attempts and identify key figures in abolitionist networks. This intelligence became one of the most lucrative arms of the operation. The Whitworths had formal partnerships with 3 major slave-catching outfits, whose territories spanned from Virginia to Georgia. These professionals paid dearly for accurate maps of safe houses, rumored escapes, and upcoming flights. A single arrest based on Whitworth intelligence could net thousands of dollars profits shared between the bounty hunters and the family. Yet even these riches paled in comparison to the body trade. Serif's reputation among medical institutions had blossomed. He embalmed bodies using methods learned in Scotland, packing them into airtight crates, complete with authentic-looking papers, stating they were free people of color who had died of consumption or fever. Each cadaver earned the family between $50 and $100, a princely sum at the time. During this era, Lilith Whitworth came of age. She joined the family business first as a sweet youthful presence. Her innocent appearance disarmed suspicion even more effectively than Miriam's sophistication. She greeted new arrivals with wide eyes and quiet sympathy. To the desperate, she seemed the embodiment of angelic compassion. But Gabriel was more impressed by what lay beneath her total lack of empathy. She watched pain without flinching. She listened to screams without emotion. she would soon take on greater responsibilities. Despite the horror at their core, the Whitworths maintained a flawless public image. Gabriel continued to preach on Sundays at the local Methodist church. The family hosted banquets, gave to charities, and took part in every facet of polite society. Constance was admired for her embroidery and her tireless work with the ladies' auxiliary. They were, by all appearances, the model of godly Southern virtue. By 1795, their operation had far surpassed Gabriel's original vision. What began as opportunistic profiteering had matured into a criminal syndicate sprawling across 4 states. Their success attracted others, men and women of means, ambition, and moral flexibility. Thus the Southern Redemption Society was born. Its members were a who's who of Southern society: plantation owners, traders, professional manhunters, corrupt judges, and even ministers who shared Gabriel's twisted theology of redemptive suffering. Monthly gatherings rotated between estates, masquerading as revivals or genteel socials. Membership required dues scaled by profits, and those funds were funneled into bribery, transportation, and expansion. Among the society's most critical assets was Dr. Edmund Thorne, a respected physician in Charleston. With his real credentials and spotless reputation, Thorne provided the final layer of legitimacy. He signed death certificates arranged for transport and used his influence with ship captains to move bodies north to medical schools without attracting scrutiny. With him, the entire supply chain became airtight. No one suspected. No one dared question. The devil, it seemed, wore a perfectly tailored coat and preached salvation from a polished pulpit. Captain Marcus Fulton was a name spoken in hushed tones across the South. He operated with the cold efficiency of a military campaign, commanding a network of slave catchers that roamed the Carolinas and Georgia like hounds in the night. But unlike typical bounty hunters, Fulton didn't just react, he hunted with purpose. His men pursued individuals with detailed precision, thanks to the intelligence pipeline provided by the Whitworth family. With dossiers compiled by able behavioral patterns, mapped by Seraph, and trust earned by Miriam or Lilith, each fugitive was more than a name. They were a target marked for erasure. Fulton's methods were infamous. When his network discovered a planned escape, they often captured entire families, parents, children, distant relatives, believing that eliminating the route prevented future resistance. The captain paid the Whitworths handsomely for their contributions, rewarding them with a generous percentage of the bounties collected. In time, it became a well-oiled operation. The Whitworths would extract intelligence, and Fulton's crew would clean up the aftermath. Perhaps even more chilling was the role of Reverend Josiah Blackwood, a Methodist minister assigned to 3 counties in eastern South Carolina. From the pulpit, he preached redemption and obedience. In private, he played the role of informant and facilitator. Blackwood used his position within the church to identify vulnerable or disgruntled members of his congregation. With a warm smile and promises of spiritual guidance, he earned their trust and then relayed their names and suspicions to the Whitworths. Blackwood's betrayal didn't end with betrayal in life. It extended to death. He conducted funeral services for victims of the Angels Rest Chapel, reading scripture over forged death certificates that claimed they had succumbed to fever consumption or God's will. The lies were seamless, cloaked in religious solemnity. parishioners suspected nothing. For years he buried souls who had never truly been laid to rest. As the Southern Redemption Society grew in power and influence, its operations became more complex. Gabriel Whitworth adapted accordingly. He created a codified system of communication that allowed members to share vital intelligence without fear of interception. Letters laced with religious language discussing spiritual trials, redeemed vessels, and salvific journeys contained hidden codes. A phrase about a shepherd's burden could signal an impending escape in Beaufort County. Rising waters might indicate a safe house in Savannah had been compromised. These coded letters were preserved and rediscovered over a century later, offering historians a rare window into the society's operations. They revealed not just names and places, but a twisted ideology that justified every act of cruelty in the language of divine will. Serif Ever, the meticulous innovator, had evolved far beyond his original role. No longer just a torturer or embalmer, he became something resembling a forensic analyst. Using data gathered from years of interrogations, he mapped patterns in escape routes, identifying shifts in behavior tied to the season's river tides, and even plantation guard rotations. His insights allowed the society to position assets with eerie precision. Escapees rarely made it more than 50 miles before being intercepted. To accommodate this growth, the family's chapel underwent further renovations. The basement was expanded to hold 12 reinforced cells. Extra layers of soundproofing were installed thicker than before, with double insulation and stone-lined walls. A separate structure disguised as a modest pottery kiln near the fields functioned as a crematorium. Bodies that were too damaged for resale or whose details risked exposure were quietly reduced to ash and buried beneath the rice paddies. The Whitworths expanded their workforce too, hiring 6 more operatives, trusted society members, trained in Gabriel's unique doctrine. These individuals handled everything from transportation to data collection to body preparation. And as always, the family stayed involved at every level. Lilith, now 18, had assumed full responsibility for handling female captives. Her transformation was complete. She had mastered the art of maternal deception, appearing as a comforting sister or surrogate daughter to the women who stumbled into Angel's Rest. She would coo to their children, braid their hair, whisper songs, while offering warm meals, and all the while gather intelligence with surgical precision. If a mother hesitated during interrogation, Lilith might softly remind her what was at stake by placing a gentle hand on her child's shoulder. Her genius was in the contrast between her outward gentleness and the emotional void within. Gabriel often referred to her as his perfect vessel. She needed no correction, no coaching. She simply did what had to be done. Cain and Abel had by now refined their roles to an art form. Cain, built like an ox and methodical to the point of obsession, managed the physical infrastructure, transporting victims in false-bottomed wagons, repairing equipment, and destroying evidence. Abel, thinner and more cerebral, was the archivist of the damned. He maintained the family's infamous ledgers, charting everything from intelligence networks to bodily conditions to the timing of cremation schedules. Together, the twins turned the chapel into a machine. From the moment a desperate soul arrived, every step from false hope to final disposal was measured in hours. On average, victims were processed in under 48 hours. The system maximized profitability and minimized exposure. Every inch of the operation was designed for function, and every member of the family played their part without hesitation. But with success came scrutiny. Whispers of trouble were rising in the North. Abolitionist societies began to notice a disturbing trend. Large numbers of runaways vanished after leaving plantations in the Low Country. Normally, even unsuccessful escapes resulted in capture trial or public sale. But in these cases, people simply disappeared. No public records, no auction listings, no return. Articles began appearing in northern newspapers. The Boston Liberator published a story about mysterious disappearances in South Carolina. An editorial in the Philadelphia Freeman noted with alarm that no one had heard from known conductors after their southern assignments. Something was wrong, and those working along the Underground Railroad began to grow wary. Trusted contacts stopped responding. Arranged handoffs never happened. Safe houses waited in vain. Even freedom, it seemed, had begun to bleed into silence. By the winter of 1798, rumors had begun to bleed through the icy fog of abolitionist networks. Whispers of a graveyard in disguise somewhere in the marshy shadows of South Carolina. Those stories were scattered and fragmented. Too many were ending the same vanished escapees, fragmented families, and a supposed sanctuary called Angel's Rest that felt more like a trap than a haven. Enter Jeremiah Morrison, a 45-year-old Quaker merchant from Philadelphia, with tired eyes, calloused hands, and a heart that refused to ignore injustice. Officially, he had arrived in Charleston to establish new trade ties with rice planters. Unofficially, he was working on behalf of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, seeking answers to a question that had begun to haunt their records. Why were so many who had safely reached the Mason-Dixon line recounting loved ones who disappeared somewhere between the Carolinas and Hope? Morrison had spent years helping men and women escape bondage, and the scars of those years, emotional and physical, had sharpened his instincts. Something about South Carolina's low country stories didn't sit right. The patterns were too specific, the disappearances too consistent. He began by quietly interviewing escapees already living in northern cities, Philadelphia, New York, Boston. Again and again one name arose, Angel's Rest. Some had been there and escaped only after a brief stay, their survival fueled by an instinctual dread. Others had sent kin there with desperate trust, never to hear from them again. Morrison catalogued every detail, dates, routes, names, even physical descriptions of the chapel. A troubling pattern emerged. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, were vanishing in one isolated corner of the Low Country. But Morrison knew he could not walk into the lion's den himself. His white skin, Quaker dress, and refined manners would never pass for a fugitive's. He needed someone who could infiltrate the trap. That someone was Samuel Washington, a free black man from Baltimore, educated in Pennsylvania, fluent in scripture and subterfuge. Light-skinned enough to pass as mixed race, Samuel had already survived multiple dangerous missions, gathering intelligence in Virginia and Maryland. Calm under pressure and driven by conviction, he volunteered for the task with solemn resolve. By March 1799, Samuel had quietly arrived in Charleston under false pretenses, carrying forged documents, naming him the property of a fictional Virginia planter. He blended into the city's rhythms as a day laborer, slowly absorbing its shadows. Within weeks, whispers reached him through the quiet corridors of the Underground Railroad. There was a place, Angel's Rest, where help might be found if one knew the passwords and believed the rumors. It took time and subtle maneuvering, but eventually Samuel received directions to the Whitworth plantation, along with the coded phrases required to be welcomed as a seeker of freedom. While Samuel prepared for his journey into the dark, Morrison continued working from within Charleston's merchant elite. His credentials opened doors, shipping manifests, correspondences from medical colleges, church registries. With help from abolitionist allies back in Philadelphia, he identified professors and doctors who had received suspicious donations from the South. What he uncovered chilled him. Shipping logs confirmed regular deliveries from the Charleston area to medical schools across the mid-Atlantic. The volume defied logic. Too many cadavers for such a small population of free blacks. Too many death certificates citing fever or natural causes signed by the same physicians, all describing individuals as transient or unclaimed. Meanwhile, Samuel Washington set out for the chapel. It was a humid April dusk when he arrived at Angel's Rest. The chapel emerged from the moss-draped trees like a relic of Judgment Day. Its Gothic windows glinted in the dying light, casting long shadows across the marshy path. Spanish moss hung like funeral veils from the surrounding oaks. The very air seemed to carry a heaviness that whispered, "Turn back." Miriam Whitworth was waiting at the door. She greeted him like a savior might greet the weary, golden-haired, soft-eyed, and calm as a Sunday hymn. "You must be so tired, poor soul," she said with the soothing lilt of practiced compassion. "Come in, let me get you food, a place to rest. Tomorrow we'll discuss your journey north." Inside the chapel was far more elaborate than Samuel had expected. The stained glass showed not gentle shepherds or beatific saints, but images of divine wrath fire chains, swords. Behind the altar loomed a painting of the Archangel Michael hurling demons into hell. This was not a sanctuary, it was a warning. Samuel was fed simple bread and stew, given clean clothes, and shown to a small room beside the chapel. Miriam explained in gentle tones that they had to verify his story before allowing him to continue. Just a few days, she promised, a necessary precaution to protect everyone. On the second day, Samuel met the rest of the family. Gabriel Whitworth, towering and silver-haired, radiated patriarchal authority. His sermons in the chapel were magnetic, filled with talk of salvation and righteousness, tailored with disturbing precision to soothe the desperate. But Samuel noticed the cracks. The other guests at the plantation avoided eye contact. Their answers were vague, their voices hushed. When asked where they'd come from or who they hoped to meet up north, they stumbled. Some wept silently when alone. Others flinched at the sound of footsteps. Most alarming was the way they looked at the Whitworths, not with reverence, but with a haunting mix of gratitude and dread. They had seen something they couldn't unsee. Then, on the third night, the horror unveiled itself. Samuel awoke in darkness to the sound of muffled screams. They came from beneath the chapel, desperate, human, unmistakably real. They continued for what felt like an hour before dying out just before dawn. The next morning, when he gently inquired, the others denied having heard anything. Their eyes pleaded with him not to ask again. Samuel knew he was inside a nightmare, but he also knew he had to stay. No one else would get this close again. He began memorizing everything, the layout of the buildings, the schedule of prayers, who came and went. He watched and waited, searching for the proof he needed to bring this evil into the light. Then the breakthrough. He saw Serif gaunt, pale, clinical loading wooden crates onto a wagon. They were coffin-sized and handled with the reverent care reserved for something valuable. Samuel followed at a distance as the wagon wound through the swamp trails to a dock on the Ashley River. There, under the cover of trees, a small steamboat waited its crew, working quietly under moonlight. It was the final step of the trade. Not salvation, not mercy, just the efficient delivery of human cargo. But Samuel wasn't as invisible as he believed. Someone had seen him watching, someone who would not let him walk away. Abel Whitworth had noticed something of too many questions, too many long stares. The man calling himself Samuel Washington was not just another frightened fugitive. Abel reported his suspicions to Gabriel, who wasted no time. Their guest had become a threat. That evening, Washington was seized and dragged down the narrow staircase beneath the chapel. His investigation had ended. Now he faced a far more personal battle survival. What awaited him in the chapel's underbelly was a vision of hell carved into stone. The air changed the moment he crossed the threshold. Thick, sour, saturated with the unmistakable stench of death. The underground facility was far larger than he'd imagined. A grim warren of 12 individual cells, a surgical laboratory equipped with gleaming tools, and what appeared to be a crematorium cleverly disguised as a pottery kiln. Bloodstains blackened the walls. Deep gouges clawed into the stone told silent stories of agony. The bucket in his cell had not been emptied. The ceiling vent let in only enough air to ensure the suffering lingered long. Within hours, Samuel heard whispers from neighboring cells. Broken voices. Some had been imprisoned for weeks, starved and tortured into spilling details about the Underground Railroad escape routes, sympathizers' contact points. Others were newer still, clinging to the illusion that help was coming. But all of them understood one thing. No one left Angel's Rest alive. The interrogations began immediately. Sheriff Whitworth, precise and cold, handled them personally. He applied pain not with rage, but with a scholar's fascination. Each incision measured every nerve, manipulated to cause suffering without permanent damage. Not yet, at least. Samuel's intelligence and calm demeanor marked him as special. The family suspected ties to northern abolitionist circles, and they were determined to extract every detail of funding, logistics, and personnel from him before reducing him to another specimen. But Samuel had trained for this. His work in Philadelphia had included techniques for resisting torture. His Quaker faith provided steel beneath the skin. He wove lies between kernels of truth, misdirection laced with just enough accuracy to seem convincing. He needed time not just to survive, but to find a weakness, and that weakness arrived in the form of a child. Grace Whitworth, 13 years old, one of Michael's twin daughters, was being educated in the family business. Her job was to deliver food to the prisoners. But unlike the others, Grace hadn't yet lost her soul. She flinched when she heard screams. Her gaze lingered too long on the wounds. And slowly, Samuel spoke to her, not pleading, but reasoning, sowing doubts, where fire and brimstone had once ruled. She listened. He spoke gently, using scripture not as a weapon, but as balm. He asked questions. Did she believe pain could be holy? Did God not say all were equal in his eyes over days? Her answers softened. Grace, raised in a world where sinners were destined for the blade, began to see Samuel as something more than a prisoner. She saw a man, dignified, educated human. She agreed to help him escape. The plan was simple in theory, perilous in practice. On her next visit, she would leave his cell door unlatched. He would slip into the lab, retrieve a scalpel, and navigate the plantation grounds under cover of darkness. If he could reach the Ashley River, he could steal a boat and disappear into the marsh. But it went wrong immediately. Grace's hesitations had not gone unnoticed. Her twin sister Mercy, ever loyal to their father, had seen her linger too long near Samuel's cell. That night, when he eased open the door and crept into the corridor, Abel was waiting in the shadows, a pistol in one hand, a smirk on his lips. "Did you really think we wouldn't notice?" he asked, motioning for Samuel to return to his cell. "Poor little Grace thought she was saving your soul. Instead, she's just ensured your death will be much more unpleasant than we originally planned." They dragged him back. But something had shifted. The attempt had exposed cracks in the family's armor. Grace's actions meant not all Whitworths were beyond redemption, and their urgency now meant they considered him a real threat. That night, he overheard Gabriel and Seraph speaking in hushed tones in the lab above. Gabriel wanted one last round of questioning. Seraph, less sentimental, argued that Washington's intelligence and influence made him too dangerous to live. They agreed on a final interrogation, one that would almost certainly prove fatal. But Washington wasn't finished yet. Over his weeks of captivity, he had recorded everything in his mind: the layout of the facility, the faces and names of the Whitworths, the behavior patterns of each. He had memorized maps, escape routes, and above all, the stories whispered through walls by dying men and women. He had built a mental archive of the network the family was trying to erase. When Seraph arrived for the last session, Washington made an offer. He would reveal names, funding sources, and locations used by Northern abolitionists if he were granted a quick, painless death. Seraph paused. The Southern Redemption Society valued intelligence. If the prisoner could produce meaningful data, his corpse might be worth less than his words. What Seraph didn't know was that Washington was stalling, because far above the chapel, help had already begun to move. Jeremiah Morrison had grown uneasy. His partner had been silent for too long. Whispers of disappearances had reached even Charleston's free black communities, and Morrison's quiet inquiries had stirred others. A small group of abolitionists began organizing. At dawn, on a humid June morning, fog curled low over the Ashley River like a shroud. Morrison led the assault. With him were 2 Quaker volunteers from Philadelphia and 4 brave free black men from Charleston who had risked everything for justice. They'd studied maps, memorized routines, and selected a perfect distraction fire. As the blaze erupted in the rice processing house, smoke and panic spread across the plantation. Workers screamed. Family members rushed to salvage equipment. And beneath that chaos, Morrison's team slipped silently into the chapel. They found the entrance beneath the pulpit and descended into darkness. What they discovered defied even their worst expectations. 11 prisoners still lived in the cells, including Samuel, barely breathing, skin-torn, eyes bruised, but still sharp. The lab was a chamber of horrors. Shelves of preserved organs, ledgers tracking over 800 confirmed murders, maps showing shattered underground railroad routes, letters from medical schools thanking the Whitworths for specimens. And then they found Serif's journal, a clinical log of torment, observations on pain thresholds, responses to trauma charts, documenting which methods broke the human will fastest. The prisoners he had written were necessary tools in his research. The rescuers had intended to flee immediately, but Washington insisted they take the records. Evidence, he rasped as they carried him up the stairs. It has to end. They gathered what they could. The proof was undeniable. The monster's mask had finally slipped. The days of Angel's Rest were numbered. Despite the pain etched deep into his body, Samuel Washington refused to rest. He moved through the shadows of the chapel basement, with Morrison's men collecting the most damning evidence ledgers inked in blood letters between conspirators, anatomical diagrams marked with victims' names. Time was slipping fast. They had perhaps 30 minutes before the fire outside was contained. Before the Whitworths realized their carefully hidden chamber of horrors had been breached. What they carried from that hellish place would do more than just expose one family. It would unravel an entire web of Southern cruelty disguised as sanctity. The documents told a story too monstrous to be fiction. False sanctuaries in Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia, all modeled after Angel's Rest, all luring the desperate with promises of salvation, only to harvest their bodies and souls. The scope of the Southern Redemption Society's operations extended far beyond what even Morrison, a veteran of many dark truths, had feared. But Gabriel Whitworth had built his empire with foresight and ruthless precision. As soon as he realized what had occurred, he triggered contingency plans that had long been in place for exactly this moment. Escape routes were activated, wealth was transferred, and most crucially, powerful allies were called in. Gabriel's years of careful manipulation bore fruit. Judges, sheriffs, and state legislators, many of whom owed their very positions to the planter class, closed ranks. When Morrison presented his trove of evidence to local authorities, he was met with scoffs and veiled threats. The papers were labeled Northern Propaganda, a plot to destabilize the South. One sheriff even refused to open the sealed crates containing the preserved remains, claiming they violated local decorum. Federal agents in Charleston were more sympathetic, but they were powerless. The Constitution's guarantee of state sovereignty shackled them. Without South Carolina's cooperation, they could not prosecute crimes committed entirely within its borders, and South Carolina refused. Even the Methodist Church, so deeply entwined with the Whitworth family's public persona, recoiled from the truth. Church leaders refused to denounce Gabriel. Reverend Hartwell, the very man who had once welcomed Gabriel's ministry, condemned the investigation as a malicious campaign against Christian values. He called Morrison a heretic and warned his congregation not to be tempted by the whispers of abolitionist devils. With their reputations still mostly intact, and their enemies silenced by politics and fear. The Whitworths vanished from the Charleston Low Country. Within 6 months, Seraphim's Grace Plantation was sold off in pieces. The family re-emerged in the Alabama Territory, where the law was thinner and ambition was thick. There they built something even worse. 20 miles north of Mobile, near the muddy banks of the Tombigbee River, the family established a new estate, New Seraphim, with its own chapel, its own false sanctuary, and its own underground catacombs. The operation resumed with terrifying efficiency. Gabriel had hired an architect from New Orleans to design a church that masked its true purpose, a gleaming white symbol of piety above and a dungeon of torment below. This time they were ready for scrutiny. Gabriel embedded himself into Alabama society with the same calculated charm he had used before. Donations flowed to officials' campaigns. Lavish dinners were held. When the territorial government formed its council, Gabriel was on it. From within, he helped shape laws and lawmen alike, ensuring their new empire would be shielded by the very statutes meant to keep people safe. The underground complex at New Seraphim could hold up to 30 people at a time. It was more advanced, more efficient, and more invisible than the South Carolina facility. Seraph oversaw the new medical laboratory, expanded with equipment smuggled from northern colleges, who unknowingly continued to fund the very horror Morrison had tried to end. But the family also evolved their methods. They realized the flaw of relying solely on fake sanctuaries. From now on, their darkness would wear many masks. Gabriel obtained a legal slave trader's license. It was the perfect disguise. Under the veil of legality, he traveled freely across state lines, meeting with plantation owners and brokers. His specialty, problem slaves, those too clever, too rebellious, too brave. The very ones who might run again or who might lead others to freedom. Their purchase and disappearance could be easily explained as transfers to faraway plantations. But it was Ezekiel who devised a new horror. He began acquiring enslaved people for a singular purpose, to extract intelligence through pain. Not escapees, not sanctuary seekers, but people chosen at auction, tortured for weeks, for whatever scraps they knew about underground railroad conductors, safe houses, or sympathetic preachers. Once emptied of their secrets, they were sold off to the most remote, brutal plantations. Ezekiel could find places where no one escaped and no one asked questions. This hybrid model, legitimate commerce masking clandestine cruelty, made the family richer than ever. It also made them harder to trace. But they had miscalculated one thing: the power of stories. Back in the North, Samuel Washington's testimony, combined with the evidence Morrison's team had risked everything to retrieve, ignited a fire in abolitionist circles. Northern newspapers ran front-page exposés. Headlines screamed of the devil's sanctuary and murder in the name of God. Paintings depicted Angel's Rest as a Gothic inferno. Sermons thundered against the corruption of Southern churches. Pamphlets flooded abolitionist meetings. The Whitworth case had become legend, a rallying cry for those who believed slavery was not just immoral, but demonic in its depths. Though the family lived on in Alabama, their days of anonymity were over. Their enemies were growing, and now people were watching. The Whitworth family's reach in Alabama soon eclipsed anything they had built in South Carolina. The Alabama Territory, still raw and lawless in many places, had attracted waves of settlers from Georgia and the Carolinas, men hardened by war and primed to defend slavery at all costs. Many of them shared the Whitworths' belief that brutality was not merely necessary, but sacred. Within months, Gabriel had secured partnerships with some of the region's most prominent planters. These men supplied intelligence about likely escapees, and in return, they shared in the profits earned in blood, bone, and silence. Miriam, now a woman of poise and ruthless precision, had married Captain James Patterson, a former naval officer whose riverboat, the Sweet Salvation, became an artery of the family's underground operation. Bodies destined for dissection traveled north under cover of night. Living captives were quietly relocated to plantations deep in the interior places where even God refused to look. Lilith, now 22, had blossomed into the most terrifying creature of the family's brood. With porcelain skin, angelic features, and a voice like music, she moved through social circles like a serpent in silk. Boat captains, shopkeepers, customs agents, even a few junior federal officials believed themselves to be her secret lover. Each whispered to her the details she wanted: who was moving north, who was hiding, who was helping. Meanwhile, Cain and Abel had carved their own empires of depravity. Cain ran a mobile blacksmith shop that quietly supplied shackles cages and mobile holding pens to slave traders across the Gulf Coast. Abel, ever the archivist, dealt in anatomical curiosities, pickled fetuses, deformed skulls, preserved organs sold to northern medical schools and European collectors. He was known by clients only as Mr. A shadowy supplier whose specimens never came with questions. But it was Seraph, whose pursuits reached new levels of horror. His years as a torturer had evolved into something far more clinical. He began calling it research. Inside the laboratory beneath New Seraphim's chapel, he performed procedures no legitimate physician would dare even imagine. Prisoners became experiments. His journals, unearthed a century later by stunned archivists, would read like a blueprint for the atrocities of a darker age. Infection thresholds, psychological fracture points, the limits of the human nervous system under prolonged trauma. By 1805, New Seraphim processed nearly 80 victims per year, making it the most efficient killing operation in the Southern Redemption Society. Its underground compound could house 30 people at a time. And with Gabriel's expanding network of collaborators, more victims arrived every month, some still believing they had reached sanctuary. But the family had not escaped scrutiny. In Philadelphia, Jeremiah Morrison still hunted them. He had never forgotten the stench of the chapel basement in South Carolina, the mutilated prisoners, the ledgers soaked in ink and blood. Over the years, he had compiled a staggering archive of the family's movements, their business records, their new names and locations. His reports, delivered regularly to the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, painted a picture of a criminal empire that defied imagination. Now Morrison's documents were landing on desks in Washington. Secretary of State James Madison, a careful politician balancing the fragile union between North and South, found himself increasingly disturbed by the rumors reaching his office. Not because he was morally appalled, though he was, but because the Whitworth network threatened to ignite political firestorms. If true, these crimes could not be ignored. But territorial Alabama was a jurisdictional quagmire. Federal power was weak. Statehood had not yet arrived. And unless Morrison could tie the family's actions to violations of interstate commerce or federal treaties, the government's hands remained tied. Then came a breakthrough. Samuel Washington, who had barely survived the Charleston facility years earlier, had been quietly building a network of informants inside the slave economy. Dock workers, barge hands, warehouse clerks, and even disillusioned overseers fed him details about strange shipments, missing people, whispered rumors of a second sanctuary, far worse than the first. And then came the most alarming intelligence of all. The Whitworth family was planning an expansion. Gabriel had made secret arrangements with medical schools in New Orleans, Richmond, and even Boston to supply anatomical specimens on a massive scale. If fulfilled, the contracts would require nearly 200 bodies per year. It would make the Alabama operation the largest murder-for-profit enterprise in American history. Worse still, Gabriel was evangelizing. He had begun meeting with planters in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Tennessee, promoting his model of false sanctuaries supported by legitimate slave trading. It was a sales pitch, cloaked in salvation, build a chapel offer, hope harvest despair. If the plan succeeded, the Southern Redemption Society would be reborn larger, richer, and more deadly than ever. Morrison knew traditional law enforcement would never be enough. Too many judges were bought. Too many sheriffs were afraid. And too many legislators believed the family was doing God's work. The only option left was direct action. The plan that emerged in a dim abolitionist meeting hall in Philadelphia was bold and dangerous. Infiltrate the Alabama operation, gather undeniable evidence, rescue the living, expose the dead, and time the mission to coincide with the gathering of Southern Redemption Society members, capturing not just the Whitworths, but the web of collaborators who had kept them alive. Washington volunteered to lead the infiltration team. Morrison objected. He had seen the scars, physical and mental, that Samuel bore. He feared this mission might destroy what remained of his friend's soul. But Washington was resolute. "No one knows them like I do," he said, "and no one has more reason to see it end." The team assembled over months, 12 volunteers handpicked from abolitionist organizations across the North. Some were Quakers bound by faith. Others were free black men risking everything to ensure that others could one day know freedom too. All knew the risks. All were ready to die. In the autumn of 1807, they arrived in Mobile, their cover slave traders from Georgia looking to invest. Forged papers, plausible plantation backstories, even a few real business dealings to establish credibility. Washington, with his light skin and refined manner, posed as a mixed-race agent working for white investors. The others assumed the roles of cynical businessmen hungry for profit. The game had begun, and for the first time in nearly a decade, the Whitworths were being hunted. The team spent weeks methodically embedding themselves within Mobile's slave trading elite. They attended auctions, exchanged drinks at riverfront taverns, and visited local plantations, always playing the part of savvy investors seeking opportunity in difficult human capital. Their goal was simple yet dangerous: arrange a meeting with Gabriel Whitworth, now whispered about as the master of the unsalvageable, the man to see when all others had failed. Meanwhile, in New Orleans, Morrison worked from a different angle. His merchant credentials, obtained years earlier for a previous mission, now gave him access to the city's academic underbelly. What he uncovered shocked even his seasoned conscience. The medical schools that received shipments from Alabama were not simply ignorant of the body's origins, they were complicit. Some professors were placing bespoke orders, cadavers with crushed ribs, burned skin, lacerated tendons, each a gruesome canvas of specific tortures. They didn't just accept the aftermath of violence. They requested it. The team's meeting with Gabriel finally came in December 1807. It was clear that Alabama had been kind to him. He had gained weight, grown florid and self-assured. The once gaunt preacher had become a lord of flesh and fire, crowned by crime and protected by a network of men too rich to fall. His plantation, New Seraphim, dwarfed its South Carolina predecessor. A massive Georgian mansion stood at its heart, flanked by ornamental gardens and stately oaks draped in Spanish moss. Every building, every brick whispered wealth. The chapel, still disguised in simplicity, was larger now, its steeple reaching toward a heaven whose silence had long since become damning. The family had expanded too. Miriam, heavy with child, glowed with maternal pride and latent cruelty. Ezekiel had married the daughter of a powerful local planter, securing additional land and influence. Lilith, radiant and deceptive as ever, was engaged to the son of a territorial judge. Even the mentally unstable Constance now played a role his erratic mutterings tolerated as the charming eccentricities of a rich man's fool. The initial meeting with Washington's team was framed as a business consultation. Gabriel described his process for acquiring problem slaves, those deemed rebellious, cunning, or violent, and explained how he broke them, rebranded them, and sold them to plantations that specialized in control. His tone was academic, almost jovial, as if discussing livestock or trade routes. But gradually, he opened more dangerous doors. He spoke of his ties to medical institutions in New Orleans, Richmond, and Boston schools that paid handsomely for fresh anatomical material. He described his intelligence network, which intercepted fugitives before they reached abolitionist havens. Most disturbingly, he waxed theological, expounding on the spiritual state of those predestined for damnation. Gabriel believed himself a divine executioner. Murder to him was ministry. The tour of the estate confirmed everything. The chapel's basement, now larger and better equipped, housed multiple wing cells, designed for specific body types, gender and resistance level. Seraph's laboratory was cleaner, colder, and more advanced than anything Morrison had seen in Charleston. Anatomical charts lined the walls, some depicting real dissections in excruciating detail, annotated in Seraph's neat, blood-spattered handwriting. What chilled Washington most was not the horror itself, but the casualness with which it was discussed. Torture techniques were debated like recipes. Restraints were demonstrated by Lilith, with professional detachment, as if unveiling a new fashion. Even Constance, once nearly unhinged, now spoke with eerie calm about waste disposal and organ preservation. The invitation to stay for several days was both an opportunity and a trap. Gabriel, sensing potential new partners, offered Washington's team access to observe the operation in full. But such access came at a price: proximity to discovery. A single misstep, an inconsistent story, a poorly concealed expression would mean death, likely preceded by hours on Seraph's table. The turning point came when Gabriel invited Washington to witness an interrogation. The subject was a captured young man who had tried to flee to Pennsylvania. Stripped and restrained in the lab, he was subjected to a carefully orchestrated assault, Serif's signature blend of physical agony and psychological pressure. As blood dripped onto the stone floor, information flowed: names of safe houses, conductors' caches of food and clothing, even the schedules of ferry captains known to be sympathetic. The intelligence was staggering. Each answer, meticulously recorded, would soon be dispatched to slave catchers across 3 states. The Underground Railroad wasn't just under attack, it was being mapped and dismantled. But Washington saw something Gabriel did not. The prisoner was clever. He gave real names, yes, but mixed them with false leads, exaggerations, and carefully designed lies. His misdirection, delivered through bloodied lips, revealed not only courage, but training. Someone had taught this young man how to resist. It was a fragile glimmer of hope, but it was hope nonetheless. As the year waned, Washington remained embedded at New Seraphim, even as preparations for the annual gathering of the Southern Redemption Society began. Gabriel expected nearly 30 guests: planters, traders, doctors, and judges from across the Deep South. It would be the largest assembly of the society since its founding, a dark convocation masked as a religious revival. Gabriel's deception was masterful. Advertisements ran in the Alabama Gazette praising his ministry's revivalist fervor. Testimonials from prominent landowners lauded his preaching on redemptive fire and biblical justice. No one questioned why the revival was closed to the public. The plantation grounds were transformed into a sacred theater for the elite of a murderous empire. Washington, watching from within, began identifying familiar faces. Dr. Edmund Thorne had returned from the Caribbean, evidently confident that the Charleston scandal had been buried. Captain Fulton, missing since Morrison's investigation, now operated in Mississippi. Most shocking of all was the arrival of Reverend Blackwood, once thought to have repented and turned to true faith. But here he was, robe pressed, hands clasped, eyes hollow with zeal. They came one by one, merchants who moved bodies under false shipping manifests, planters who marked rebellious slaves for redemption, physicians who dissected evidence, and sheriffs who buried inquiries beneath bribes and threats. Washington knew what this gathering meant. It was the heart of the Southern Redemption Society, the apex of a monstrous pyramid whose base stretched across the Deep South. And now, for the first time, its leaders were all gathered in one place, ripe for exposure or annihilation. Together they commanded a network that stretched from the tidewater estates of Virginia to the swamps of Louisiana, processing hundreds of human lives annually beneath a veneer of piety and respectability. Within the grand parlor of the New Seraphim plantation, the Southern Redemption Society convened its most audacious assembly yet. By day, their gatherings masqueraded as theological seminars, meditations on predestination, divine justice, and the sinful nature of man. But behind closed doors, in whispered councils, held over bourbon and bloodied ledgers, the true business unfolded. Participants exchanged intelligence on Underground Railroad activity, devised countermeasures to abolitionist investigations, and mapped out territorial expansion. Washington, posing as one of them, bore witness to it all. What he documented would eclipse anything previously uncovered by Northern investigators. Gabriel Whitworth's opening address revealed the full magnitude of his ambition. He envisioned expansion into the Louisiana Territory, where legal oversight was even more lax than Alabama's. New false sanctuaries were already in planning stages for Mississippi and Tennessee, each designed to process more victims with mechanical efficiency. But most chilling of all was his proposal for industrial-scale redemption facilities, capable of killing and processing dozens of people simultaneously under the guise of theology trade and research. Then Serif took the floor. His presentation on enhanced medical research stunned even some hardened society members. He described procedures that tested the limits of human endurance surgical trials conducted without anesthesia and vivisections performed for the sake of anatomical precision. His notes had already attracted the attention of European universities, creating an international market for specimens. This was no longer simply a southern atrocity. It had become a transatlantic economy of horror. But the society was feeling pressure. Abolitionist networks were growing more organized. Federal scrutiny had intensified. Members shared stories of Northern investigators sniffing too close of newspapers, publishing disturbing rumors. Still, the society's response was not to retreat, but to accelerate. Their solution was twofold. First, to expand their legitimate fronts, slave trading firms, medical supply businesses, shipping enterprises, all perfectly legal, all pipelines for murder. Second, to eliminate their enemies. Gabriel had prepared a list: abolitionists, escaped slaves, sympathetic officials, each marked for death by means designed to look accidental. Murder by poison carriage accidents, house fires. Samuel Washington's name was on that list. So was Morrison's. But Gabriel had miscalculated. Morrison's team had already encircled the plantation. Before dawn, on January 15, 1808, they moved into position. The timing was exact. Nearly the entire leadership of the Southern Redemption Society was gathered on site. Their guards lowered their sins on full display. The assault was swift and surgical. It began with simultaneous strikes on the main house and the chapel. Morrison led the team breaching the chapel, navigating its concealed entrance with maps provided by Washington. There, in the stifling underground, they found 17 prisoners, emaciated, mutilated, barely alive. The scars on their bodies told stories more eloquent than any testimony could. The rooms stank of rot and metal. The walls, thick with soundproofing, had absorbed years of screams. Meanwhile, Washington led the raid on Gabriel's private office. Despite his years of investigation, nothing could have prepared him for the sheer volume of records Gabriel had kept. He moved like a man possessed, pulling drawers, unlocking cabinets, unsealing iron-bound ledgers. What he found was staggering. There were accounting books tracking over 1,500 murders in meticulous detail. Correspondence exposed partnerships in 12 U.S. states and 3 foreign countries. Maps annotated escape routes, abolitionist safe houses, and underground railroad lines, all methodically compromised. Then there was Gabriel's personal journal, written in the tone of a firebrand preacher. It catalogued murder after murder, each framed as a spiritual act. It described the doctrine behind the operations, the theological necessity of each execution. The journal wasn't merely a record, it was a gospel of genocide. Serif's laboratory provided the final nail in the coffin. Shelves lined with pickled organs, drawers of bones marked by surgical incisions, diaries detailing surgical procedures performed on living victims, measuring resistance to shock blood loss organ removal. Glass jars preserved heads and hands and torsos. Some specimens had been ordered by name by medical schools in Europe and the American North. No one could claim ignorance anymore. Captured society members quickly crumbled under interrogation. Some named accomplices in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Tennessee. Others admitted bribing officials, judges, sheriffs, even clergy to protect the network. One confessed to murdering an abolitionist pastor in Virginia and staging the scene as a drunken fall downstairs. It was a rot that went from basement torture chambers to the halls of government. As for Gabriel, he offered no denial. When confronted with the documents and bodies, he merely smiled and began explaining his doctrine. He spoke of divine justice of the elect and the damned of blood as sacrament. He argued that he had simply helped expedite the fate of those already condemned. He seemed, if anything, proud. In later court proceedings, Gabriel would defend himself not as a criminal, but as a prophet. He claimed divine visions had guided his actions, that every drop of blood spilled had been in service to heaven's design. He did not plead for mercy. He demanded vindication. But the evidence was undeniable. The Whitworth empire, rooted in scripture built on bodies, was finished. Gabriel Whitworth's utter lack of remorse marked him as one of the most chilling criminals in American history to that point. But the trials that followed laid bare the limitations of early 19th century justice. Though the federal authorities had gathered overwhelming evidence, ledgers soaked in blood bodies, buried beneath chapels, confessions offered without shame, justice stumbled. Territorial Alabama was still more feudal fiefdom than functioning republic. Jurisdictional loopholes and constitutional technicalities became shields for the accused. Key witnesses vanished, some silenced in the dark by knives and poison, others frightened into silence by letters written in blood and delivered at night. A few were simply bought their loyalty, sold to Southern sympathizers who still clung to the illusion of nobility in the planter class. Local authorities refused to cooperate with federal prosecutors, claiming that the raids had violated the sacred boundaries of state sovereignty. Alabama planters, fearing the precedent such prosecutions might set, rallied in defense of the accused. Legal defense funds were raised. Speeches were delivered. The narrative was flipped. The criminals became martyrs, victims of northern aggression, men and women simply protecting the Southern way of life. What should have been a swift reckoning became a 3-year legal quagmire. The Whitworth case became more than a trial. It became a symbol of the growing fault line between North and South, a prelude to the Civil War that would erupt decades later. Gabriel Whitworth was ultimately convicted of murder and hanged in 1811. His execution drew crowds, some jeering, some praying. But the gallows did not shake the foundations of the network he had built. Most of his family and co-conspirators escaped justice, protected by legal maneuvering, political muscle, and the familiar Southern disease of moral blindness. Serif Whitworth slipped across the border into Mexico before he could be arrested, carrying with him years of anatomical journals and diagrams soaked in pain. He sold his research to European collectors and vanished into the shadows of medical myth. In 1834, rumors surfaced of a white doctor conducting experiments on captured Comanche warriors in Texas, grisly echoes of his work in Alabama. No one ever confirmed his identity. No one ever stopped him. Ezekiel, along with the twins Cain and Abel, were convicted of lesser crimes, sentenced to long terms in prison. But within 2 years, they were quietly released, another victory for political influence over justice. Ezekiel opened a slave trading post in Texas. Cain and Abel, under false names, began a new enterprise robbing graves and supplying medical schools with fresh corpses across the Southwest. Miriam and Lilith, cloaked in beauty and charm, evaded prosecution entirely. Captain Patterson, Miriam's husband, spirited them out of Alabama aboard the Sweet Salvation, disappearing into New Orleans' maze of cultures. Whispers placed them later in Mexico City, running a brothel for the wealthy, where select clients disappeared and rumors swirled of bodies sold to medical universities. As always, nothing was proven. The Whitworth women had mastered the art of disappearing behind lace and perfume. Constance Whitworth, Gabriel's wife, was declared insane and committed to an asylum in Mobile. There she died in 1819, never offering a word about the empire of death she had helped build. Whether her madness was genuine or a clever mask remains unknown. With her died the final secrets of the family's early days. And yet, even as the family scattered, their exposure reshaped America. The Whitworth archives had been a map of pain and power. Their intelligence on escape routes, conductors and safe houses forced the Underground Railroad to rebuild from the roots. Long-standing paths had to be abandoned. Trusted allies fell under suspicion. Some were hunted and never seen again. The abolitionist movement, shaken but not broken, transformed. Morrison's detailed reports were published in northern newspapers and abolitionist pamphlets. No longer could slavery be dismissed as an unfortunate necessity. The public now saw it for what it was, a breeding ground for atrocities cloaked in cotton and scripture. The twisted sermons, the medical tortures, the meticulous record-keeping of murder, all under the flag of Christian virtue, struck a nerve deep in the American conscience. Samuel Washington became a national voice for abolition. He took the pulpits that Gabriel had desecrated and filled them with truth. His harrowing testimony, drawn from his time as a prisoner beneath a chapel of horrors, electrified audiences. Congregations who once sat indifferent to the slavery debate now heard the gospel of resistance. For many, Washington made abolition a sacred calling. Jeremiah Morrison continued the work. His investigations traced similar conspiracies in Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. His meticulous methods, combining intelligence gathering, document analysis, and undercover operations, shaped the future of criminal investigation. But the toll was steep. He died in 1825 at the age of 62, worn down by nightmares and a heart too heavy to carry the memories any longer. As for New Seraphim Plantation, it rotted. Locals said it was cursed. The chapel was burned in 1815, no arsonist ever caught. The underground cells remained empty but still whispering. The mansion collapsed in a storm in 1847. Only the foundation stones remained like tombstones for the countless nameless dead. Modern historians estimate that the Whitworth network was responsible for the deaths of at least 1,800 people between 1789 and 1808. Many believe the true number is far higher, lost to burned documents, silenced victims, and Southern complicity. The Whitworth case remains the earliest and most extensive example of systematic murder carried out under the guise of religious morality in American history. Gabriel's manipulation of Christian theology to justify extermination foreshadowed later cult leaders and religious extremists. His sermons were murder disguised as redemption. His legacy is a dark lesson in how sacred texts in the wrong hands become weapons. The case also revealed the corrupt alliance between medical science and exploitation. Several renowned medical schools were shown to have knowingly purchased murdered bodies. Their complicity prompted reforms in anatomy laws and spurred the eventual development of ethical medical standards. But enforcement remained weak for decades. The trail of bodies led deep into the ivory towers of science, and perhaps most chilling of all was Gabriel's record-keeping. The ledgers, maps, and letters detailed not only crimes, but strategies, a blueprint for conspiracy. His methods, decades ahead of their time, anticipated the playbooks of modern organized crime. What he built was not a family business. It was a machine powered by faith, refined by science, and greased with blood. Perhaps most disturbingly, the Whitworth case revealed the chilling inadequacy of early American justice, how fragile the rule of law becomes when confronted with crimes that cross borders, threaten power, or expose uncomfortable truths. Despite overwhelming evidence, the family's ability to avoid meaningful punishment laid bare the profound weaknesses in a justice system bound by regional politics, fragile federal authority, and deeply entrenched racial ideologies. The case showed how far the rot had spread. Respectable planters, government officials, clergymen trusted by their communities rallied to defend the Whitworths. Their support wasn't out of ignorance, it was out of complicity. The institution of slavery hadn't just brutalized the enslaved, it had corrupted the soul of an entire society. It created a world where mass murder could be rationalized as the maintenance of social order, where theology was weaponized, where torture was seen as righteous. And yet, even with the trials, even with the gallows, the complete truth was never fully brought to light. Many of the family's records were destroyed during litigation. Others remain sealed in archives, collecting dust in southern courthouses and university basements, guarded by bureaucracy, forgotten by design. In Alabama, local lore still whispers of strange disappearances and ghost stories tied to the plantation grounds. But what the locals call hauntings are in truth unburied crimes. In the 1990s, ground-penetrating radar scans of the new Seraphim plantation site revealed extensive subterranean structures, corridors, cells, hidden chambers that matched descriptions from Washington's reports. The facility may still be intact beneath the soil, quietly holding the bones of the forgotten. Yet efforts to excavate have been stonewalled by legal entanglements, by private landowners, and perhaps by a lingering fear of what lies beneath. Recent research has uncovered disturbing threads, passenger logs from Texas ports, medical supply records in Veracruz government reports, from Colombia, all referencing names and aliases linked to the Whitworths. Individuals fitting their profiles continued practicing medicine trafficking bodies and running false sanctuaries decades after Alabama. And that may be the most disturbing revelation of all. The Whitworths were not alone. Their story may be one of the only ones uncovered, not because it was the worst, but because someone happened to expose it. Across the antebellum South, how many other families protected by theology, wealth, and racism were committing similar atrocities in the name of order, profit, and salvation? The historical record contains many unexplained deaths, vanished congregations and churches with locked basements. Were these isolated horrors or part of a wider pattern? What's undeniable is this: the Whitworth legacy is one of the darkest stains on America's religious and legal history. Gabriel Whitworth's manipulation of Christian theology to justify systematic murder remains a terrifying example of how divine authority can be twisted to serve evil. His sermons turned faith into a blade. His followers sang hymns as they committed horrors. The support he received from respectable society showed just how deeply slavery had poisoned American moral consciousness. Their crimes didn't end with their victims. The intelligence they extracted through torture led to the capture and death of countless others, escaped slaves, abolitionists, and allies whose names will never grace a monument. Their influence corrupted medical science, creating a black market for human remains that tainted academic institutions for generations. And perhaps worst of all, their success in avoiding accountability showed other criminals how to hide behind respectability, religion, and law. Today, the site of New Seraphim is mostly forgotten. No monument marks the mass grave beneath its collapsed mansion. No plaque honors the bravery of Morrison Washington and the others who risked everything to expose the network. The earth is silent. The roots have grown deep, and the chapel bells have long since fallen quiet. But the story must not fade. The Whitworths are a warning, a reminder of how easily societies collapse into cruelty when hatred is dressed in holy robes, when profit trumps principle, and when justice bows to power. We must remember the worst crimes are not always committed in shadows. Sometimes they are carried out in the light of day, with Bibles in hand and crowds applauding. And perhaps that is what should haunt us most, not the fact that such evil happened, but that so much of it remains hidden, forgotten, buried, unfaced. Because the real question isn't whether the Whitworths were monsters. The real question is how many other monsters got away. If this chapter of hidden American history opened your eyes, please subscribe and click the bell icon. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think remains buried in our archives, our churches, our schools? And never forget, the silence of history is not innocence. It's evidence waiting to be heard.